Well, we're going to have the grand finale tonight in the book of Joshua. Kaleb Partin is going to come up and talk to us about Joshua 24.
All right, that's right. We're going to be turning to Joshua chapter 24. You'll turn to Joshua 24, and we'll get started here in a second. I just wanted to say that I'm thankful again, as always, for the opportunity to preach. It's been a blessing to be able to preach to y'all a couple times now over the past few months. Really feel like we're starting to be a part, you know. This is now becoming, when we think of our church and our pastor, it's this place. And because we've been here for a little bit now, we're excited for what the years have for us. But more immediately, I'm excited for this passage that we're going to be able to look at today. So, like I said, turn to Joshua chapter 24. Now, we're going to be covering most of this chapter, but we're only going to read a few verses for now. Because while I would love to read the entire chapter, we might lose some people if I did that. So let's look at a few main verses, and then we're going to work through the passage together, okay? So first, let's look at verse 1 as a context point. And it says, "And Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and called for the elders of Israel, and for their heads, and for their judges, and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God." So moving from verses 2 all the way through 13, God will be the main speaker. And that'll be the main, or the first main portion that we'll be looking at as we look through the passage in the sermon. But now if you'll jump to verse 14, and this is Joshua's response to the message from God. So God gave the introduction, and now Joshua is going to give a charge concerning the introduction that God just gave. So look in verse 14. "Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." All right, let's pray real quick before we get into the message. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for your word, as many times I have before, and I pray that as you have before, that through the preaching of your word, that you'd stir the hearts of the people here, and that you'd be able to communicate them effectively through the preaching of your word and through me today as I attempt to do so. Pray that you'll bless the Bible fellowships or the care groups to follow and give us a good day in your house. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, in a couple months, to some of the guys I imagine here, they're going to be excited about, we're getting into football season, right? Football season's about to start. How many Oregon Ducks fans are there in here? I'm just curious. All right, there's a good number. Now, from what I understand, doing a little bit of a research, because I'm not from this area, the Ducks don't like the Beavers. Is that right? Oregon State, is that the main rival? Do I have that right? You got the Oregon State Beavers and you got the Oregon Ducks, right? And they don't like each other. Now, okay, whatever. Beavers don't like the Ducks. You got it. Now, to be an Oregon Ducks fan, you cannot be an Oregon State Beavers fan, right? And to be an Oregon State Beavers fan, you cannot be an Oregon fan. They're antithetical. You can't be the same at the same time. Where I was born in Columbus, Ohio, and there you have the Ohio State Buckeyes. And they do not like the Michigan Wolverines. And every year at the end of the season, just like here, they would fight each other. Or not fight each other, they would play each other. But it was almost a fight. Their fights break out every year. And every year, down in the middle of campus, there in Columbus, Ohio, there'd be riots. People would get so worked up over this game that they'd be fighting each other. And it was not a smart decision to be wearing yellow and blue going through Ohio State campus on the game day. That wouldn't be very good for you. And for actual riots happened every year on the game day. So to be an Ohio State fan meant you were not a Wolverines fan. And to be a Wolverines fan, as some of my friends were, for some reason, I didn't understand it. Ohio State was better. But to be a Wolverines fan meant you were not an Ohio State fan. That makes sense? So they're antithetical to each other. So being an Ohio State fan is exclusive from being a Wolverines fan. And to be a Ducks fan, it's exclusive. To say I'm a fan of the Oregon Ducks means I'm not a fan of the other teams. So being a fan of a football team or a baseball team is an exclusive thing. But more serious than whatever sport that you like or whatever sport team that you follow, more serious than that is the God that you serve. And the worship of God is meant to be exclusive. You see it in the first commandment, in the very first commandment that Moses gives. I am the Lord your God. Thou shalt have no other God before me. It's an exclusive commandment. Several times through the prophets, you read how the Lord your God is a jealous God. That means he wants for you to worship him and him alone. And to give that worship to anything else would be offensive to him. Because after all, he is the only true God. And to be the worshiper of the true God is meant to be exclusive. And something I want us to remember as we work through this passage is that Israel, throughout their history, would have a habit of following God for a little bit. But then when times got tough, or when there would be an obstacle that would come their way, they would go somewhere else, looking for security, or looking for meaning, or looking for just something else to cover their bases, They'd be a worshiper of God, but then they'd throw in a little Baal worship in on the side just to cover their bases. And while we can look at the idolatry of Israel, and we can wag our heads and shake our fingers at them, we can do the same thing. You say, we worship God and we trust him, but when things get tough, and when obstacles come in our life, oftentimes, instead of just trusting in God, we will just put our trust in people. And then people fail us, so we put our trust in money or our job. And that's what we pursue. And we pursue whatever it is that we deem important to the failing of following God and worshiping God. And the thing is, there can only be one God in your life. And if it's not God himself, it's going to be something else. And the worship of God and the following God and the service of God is meant to be exclusive. Any God that Israel would be tempted to rely on other than the Lord would pale in comparison to him. You think of anything else you could follow. You think, the false gods that do exist in our culture. Who else of all the other religions can say that, there's historical fact of his existence and he's the one that rose from the dead? You look at Muhammad, he died. You look at the Hindu gods, no one's ever seen them. But our God came in the flesh, he lived among us, he died and he rose from the dead, and he's provided for us and given us salvation. Any other God that we could follow, or anything else that we could put our trust in, pales in comparison to him. And this is the main lesson in this passage. Because no matter who Israel would choose to follow, no matter who they would choose to follow, Israel should choose to serve the Lord, because God had proven, through this passage we'll see, through their history, God had proven every alternative as inferior. And we should serve the Lord too, because any alternative to him is decidedly inferior. So, in this passage, starting out, Israel is gathered to Shechem. They have all the authority figures in Israel. They gather to Shechem, and Shechem was like a home base through the book of Joshua. As we've been working through the book of Joshua, you find them in Shechem over and over and over again. And so they gathered to Shechem one last time, and we're going to have the last recorded message of Joshua to the people of Israel. And this is a real turning point in the story of Israel, because up until this point, they've been homeless. They were trapped in Egypt, and that's where they lived. And then for 40 years, they were wandering through Egypt. And then for 5 years, they were battling for Canaan. But now the battle's done, and there's going to be a turning point here. They've been following God step by step as God's been leading them to Canaan. But now they have Canaan. So how is their path going to be determined from what they have been doing to what they will be doing? And how will the people of Israel that are here now, how will they set it up for their children to follow Israel? Because we know that in the book of Judges that there's some problems that come up. They start following after other gods, just like God warned them not to. So this was a really key point. And while the people of Israel here, they make the right choice and they decide to follow the Lord, their children don't. And so what's important for us here is to decide, what are we going to do for our families, and how are we going to point our lives? Because are we going to follow the Lord, or are we going to follow after something else, anything else that can take its place? So first of all, the Lord speaks through Joshua, and the Lord reminds the leaders of Israel that he delivered their forefathers. He starts talking about their fathers, and that's where the story picks up. In verse 2, the Lord starts talking, and he starts talking about their fathers, specifically about Abraham. And through Joshua, the Lord tells of delivering Abraham from his idolatry, from the idolatry of his family. it specifically says that their fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood. Now, most scholars believe that when it says the other side of the flood, it's talking about the other side of the river Euphrates. In the river of Euphrates, that would have been speaking of the Mesopotamian area. And that was where Abraham originally lived. And in that area, that had their own gods that they followed. And God came to Abraham, and he promised him a seed, a nation that would be his, that would come after him, and a land. So God intervenes in the idolatry of this land, and he takes Abraham out, and he leads him into Israel, as we all know the story of. So that's what happens to Abraham. Abraham is saved from his idolatry, and God proves himself faithful over and over and over again. He protects Abraham when assailants would come against him. He gives him a son in his old age, and he proves himself stronger and more real than the idols that Abraham ever worshipped in his past. Because God is true, and the idols on the other side of the flood in Mesopotamia were false. So that's one set of gods down. So who should you serve, and whether it be God or the gods on the other side of the flood? Well, obviously be God, because God saved Abraham from them. And God proved himself faithful in Abraham, your father. That's what Joshua is saying to the people of Israel here. Well, the story continues for the history of the people of Israel. And Abraham's grandchildren, you have Esau and Jacob, and God gives Esau a mountain. That's what it talks about in the passage. God provided for Esau, and God provided for Jacob through a famine that came through Canaan, and Jacob's family went down to Egypt. And there in Egypt, the people of Israel were enslaved. And then, as we know, the story goes on through the book of Exodus, God sends Moses and Aaron to deliver the people of Israel out of Egypt. And he does so with 10 plagues. The 10 plagues, the story we all know about how God saved Israel from Egypt. And not only did he save Israel from Egypt, he showed himself more powerful than the gods of Egypt. There's studies that have been done on the 10 plagues and how the different plagues countered some of the gods of Egypt. You have Ra, he was the king of the gods, and he was the god of the sun. Well, what was the 9th plague? It was darkness. He showed himself in control of the light. You have gods of the Nile, and Nile was one of the main gods in the Egyptian pantheon. And God turned the river of the Nile into blood, showing himself in control of the Nile. And God was saying to the Egyptians and to the Israelites, even then, I am the Lord your God. I am more powerful than any other god you could be tempted to serve, so serve me. So God has shown himself more powerful than the gods of the Mesopotamians, and he's shown himself more powerful than the gods of the Egyptians, and that was their fathers. Through the lives of their fathers, God had provided for them and delivered them and taken to them where they are now. And there's going to be a switch. And up until now, we've been through verse number 6. And he's talking about their fathers and what God has done in the time past. And he's going to switch to talking about what they have seen. You see, the story of how God has provided for you and saved you and delivered to you where you are now has begun far before you were sitting here in this room. It began far before you were even born. God has been moving through time and through space and through the world in order to bring you here to this point. I think you slow down. I'm talking fast. I know I had a brother here just before the service that reminded me I talk a little fast, so please forgive me for that. I get excited. I just want to get the message out. Anyway, so before we were even born, God was moving in your life to bring you to where you are now. I think in my life, my grandfather, he had a bit of a Christian background, but then he saw a girl that he thought was cute, and that was my grandma. And because of her, she invited him to church, and then they were in church through their married life, and they got married. Then they had my dad, who was raised in church, and then he met my mom, and they got married, and my mom was saved. And then they raised me and my sisters in church. So before I was even born, God was orchestrating things to bring me to where I am here now. Now, that might not be everybody's story. Everybody has a different story. But the point is, as God's talking to the people of Israel, he's saying before God was even dealing with you, he was dealing with your fathers and showing himself true to your fathers so that he could bring you to where you are now, to where you can make your choice. Because every generation had to choose whether they would follow God or not. And luckily, through the story of Joshua, which is the next story that God's going to talk about, he has shown himself true to them, and they've chosen to follow him. So in verse number 7, it switches from God talking about their fathers to talking about them. And we start the story of Joshua over again. Now, I'm not going to preach the whole book of Joshua. We'd be here for a while, but that's basically what what the Lord does through Joshua. He starts recounting the story of what God has done in their lives. And he starts with the story of Balak and Balaam. Now, Balak was a king of the Amalekites, and Balaam was a false prophet of false gods. And Balak tries to get Balaam to curse Israel in the book of Numbers. Now, if anybody is having trouble remembering who Balaam's the guy with the talking donkey who was smarter than he was. Everybody remember that story? You know, he's going to curse Israel, and then God causes his donkey to try to talk some sense into him. Well, Balaam wasn't a very good guy, and he had false gods. But every time he would try to speak evil against Israel and speak a curse against Israel, every time he'd open his mouth to do so, God caused him to say a blessing on Israel. Every time. And they had multiple schemes that Balak and Balaam tried to orchestrate to take down Israel because they were afraid of Israel and they were afraid of their God. But every time, God showed himself more powerful than Balak and Balaam, and he showed himself more powerful than their false gods. And then you have a list after that about how after they came over the river Jordan in the beginning of the book of Joshua, you have people after people after people, all the ites. You have the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Girgashites. And every time one of them would come against Israel, every time God would enter the battle for them and God would deliver them. And people after people after people and false gods after false gods after false gods proved to be inferior when standing against God. You see, have you ever heard of the phrase last man standing? You know, you play a game and, I don't know, maybe you're playing a wrestling game with a bunch of guys and you're a teenager. I don't know what girls would have, what they would do and similar to that. But anyway, you have one-on-one fights of rock, paper, scissors, and if you lose, you were out, and then whoever was the last man standing wins. Well, God wasn't just the last God standing in comparison to everybody else. You can see my title up there. He's the only true God. And in comparison to any other God that you could have in your life, he's the only logical choice. And that's the case that God is building through looking through the entire story of Israel, through their fathers and through Abraham, through Egypt and through the plagues and through the war through Canaan. God is proving himself superior in every way to any false God you can compare to him. So you get to verse 14, and he says, now therefore, because of that, Joshua is now speaking, because of what God said to you and because of what God has done to your life, choose, fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. He's saying, you have a choice now. You can go back to those false gods that some of your ancestors served, and apparently it speaks of some of the gods they might even have already been worshiping in secret in some of their tents. And he said, put those away. Because when you look at all the other options, the only logical choice is to choose God. So Joshua says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But like I alluded to earlier, their children don't do that. And there's Baal worship that continuously creeps up through their children. Now, why would they be tempted to worship Baal, as we know that they do? Well, Canaan was a different type of land than most ancient civilizations. Most ancient civilizations, you learn this in history class when you're in high school, is they developed around rivers, right? Well, that was because whenever there was a drought, they could depend on a river to water their crops and to get water for themselves so they could survive. You think of Egypt. Egypt was in the middle of a desert, yet they had a thriving metropolis there, and it's a thriving nation because they had the river of Nile that flooded every season that would irrigate their crops. Israel wasn't like that. Israel had the river Jordan, but Jordan was nowhere near strong enough to water their crops, to the mountainous region that is Israel. The thing is, in the nation that they would build, they would be completely dependent on rainfall. And you see that through the entire story of Israel. When you go through the book of Judges and you go through the books of the kings and the prophets, every single time not every single time, but there would often be a drought that would come as a form of judgment because they were to be dependent on God for their survival. So, Baal was the god of rain. And so it might be that things might start to get a little dry out. And they start thinking, man, I don't know if we're going to make it this season. Maybe I should just pray to Baal for a little bit just to see if he can help me out a little bit. Because I'm getting kind of nervous here, and I want to make sure that my crops get rained on. So maybe I should turn to the Canaanite god of Baal to help me out a little bit. But as we know, Baal had no power over the rain because Baal didn't exist. You see the story of Elijah, and Elijah, he has his face-off with the prophets of Baal there on the mountaintop. Remember when Elijah called down fire from heaven? Baal couldn't call down fire from heaven, but God did, because God was the one that was in control. But so they would be tempted in times of insecurity to find security in other means. But ultimately, the only thing it ever amounted to was a sense of false security, because Baal was a false god, and Baal was not able to save them. And all that false security really is no security. To illustrate this, I used to work at the O'Reilly warehouse over there in Oklahoma City. And we had these pieces of equipment. They were called order pickers. And you know how a forklift, they have the forks and it raises up 20 feet in the air? Well, an order picker, you raise up with the forks. Now, I never fell off my picker, but it would have been okay if I would have fallen off my picker because I had a harness on that strapped me to the picker, and the base of the forklift was way too heavy. I wouldn't be able to topple it and fall. But you would get all the way up there and you'd be swaying a little bit as you're moving around. It was a little scary, but you were okay because you had your harness and you were safe. Well, every once in a while, I'd be working through a shift, 30 minutes would pass, and I'd be up 20 feet in the air and I'd be stocking a car part into the shelves. Then I'd realize I wasn't harnessed in. I was working with a false sense of security. And if I would have tripped, I would have fallen, because a false sense of security is no security. So here, the Israelites, they would worship Baal, and in an attempt to try to grasp a bit of security that they felt like they didn't have. And ultimately, it was meaningless, because the only true God that could provide the Israelites safety and security and meaning and any other adjective you want to put in there was God himself, because God was the only God. And any other God compared to him was meaningless. But the Israelites aren't the only people. They aren't the only people group. They aren't the only people of God that are tempted to turn someplace other than him to find security or to find life's meaning or to find safety in. Because just like the Israelites, we often are tempted to find security in faulty sources. So we chase after things other than God for fulfillment, meaning, or security. But we should serve the Lord, because any alternative is decidedly inferior. And we know that. If you think about the different options that you have, you can chase after money. But who do you know who neglects to serve God and neglects to pursue God and pursues after money? Who among those people that pursue after money do you know is fulfilled in life? Money is ultimately unfulfilling. But yet when times get tight and you're unsure of where the next paycheck is going to come from or how you're going to pay all your bills, suddenly you think, maybe I should hold a little bit closer to my pocketbook. Maybe I should be a little less giving with my money, or maybe I should skip a couple extra services so I can pick up some extra shift because what's more important to me right now is to feel financially stable, so I am going to neglect what I know to do right and in the service of God because I think I can find more security in money than I can in God. But if we think about it, and we think about how God has provided for us in our past life, ultimately, money will never provide the safety and security that God has. You think some people we can think of, maybe some people here, they chase after life's meaning and pleasure. That's all they look for, the next high, whether it be drugs or immoral practices or alcohol, and they think that is where I'm going to find life fulfillment. I have a hole in my heart that I just need to fill with something, and they chase after pleasure over and over and over and over again. And where do they find themselves? They still find themselves with a hole in the pit of their stomach or a hole in their soul, or however you want to put it. Because the only thing that can give them life fulfillment is God. And any alternative is decidedly inferior than the hole that God can fill in your life, than God himself filling that hole in your life. Money is a false sense of security, and pleasure is not going to give you life's meaning. And whatever else you're trying to fill that void with for you and your family as you're trying to serve the Lord, the only thing that you can find that fulfillment and that security in is God himself. Because next to anything else, they're all inferior. Or we might turn to people for fulfillment other than God. Some people, they get so stuck on following a certain leader that that leader becomes their God in their life. It happened with the people of Israel. In the first verses of the book of Judges, it talks about how the people of Israel followed after God as long as Joshua lived. Then as soon as Joshua died, you start reading how they start following after other gods, and every man did right which was in his own heart. And the reason for that is because for some of the people of Israel, Joshua was God in their life. They were dependent on Joshua rather than they were dependent on God. And I have something to tell you tonight, is that people will always fail in comparison to God because we're frail. We're weak. We're all made of the same flesh. And no man can fulfill the role that God is meant to fulfill in your life. So we should serve the Lord. We should follow after the Lord because any alternative to him is decidedly inferior. Notice that Joshua says to choose the Lord or the false gods. It's only one or the other. When we were traveling to Oregon, we loaded up the U-Haul and we drove south to I-40. And you could go two directions on I-40. You could go west, which would have taken us to California, where we would get on I-5 eventually and drive north up to Oregon. Or you could drive east. And driving east would take you all the way to Nashville. And Nashville is just an hour south of Ruth Ann and mine's hometown. So we're driving on our U-Haul, and I remember thinking about it when I was looking at the on-ramp. I was like, man, if I turn that way, I could go home. But I can't go home and go to where God has called me to go. I can only go one way or the other. I could either follow the Lord or I could follow after what I want, and what I want is to go home to my family. And I can't do both at the same time. Choose you this day whom you will serve, whether it be the gods your father served, or will it be me? Will it be God? You can't do both at the same time. Some of the people of Israel try, but ultimately God is dissatisfied and calls their worship false. I am the Lord your God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. You can't worship God and put anything else in that place at the same time. The throne of your life, the throne of your heart can only be held by one person or one thing. Choose God, because God is the one that'll give you safety and security and satisfaction and fulfillment. So choose God. So choose. Will you serve the true God who has saved you, guided you, and provided for you through your whole life, and even before you were born, has guided to you where you are now? Or will you pursue anything else instead of him, which is decidedly inferior?